"Hash, you're the last good man alive," said the war widow after the cowboy guarded her all winter. Twist C, protector and provider, pride, soft seed. Barbarossa, 1982, 60 min asterisk. The mule came back without her husband on a Thursday in November, and that was how I found out. I'd been wintering on the Crail spread northwest corner of a stretch of Texas that had no good name and didn't deserve one: Scrub Flats, limestone breaks, a creek that ran maybe 4 months of the year. Old Crail had hired me to fix fence line and generally be present, because his eyes had gone and he wasn't much use against trouble anymore. Then Crail died in October, quiet in his sleep, the decent way, and I stayed because I had nowhere particular to be and because his widow, Mrs. Crail, Nora, had asked me to, not with words but by simply not telling me to go. She was about 40, maybe a year or two past, brown hair gone partly silver, which she wore pinned up in the practical way of a woman who didn't think much about her hair. Her husband, Thomas Crail, had gone to fight in the late unpleasantness on the Union side, came back different, stayed different, drank himself gentle and then drank himself sideways, and finally just faded away that October like a candle you stop noticing until it's dark. She'd loved him, I think, but she'd also been managing without him for a long time before he was technically gone. So, Thursday in November, the mule came back, and I was at the fence on the south pasture when I heard her holler. I got back to the yard and she was standing there with the mule's reins and a look on her face I recognized. Not panic exactly, but the first cold understanding of something you don't want to understand. The mule had a saddlebag still on, and in the saddlebag was the remains of a 2-day trip to Garver, which was the nearest town with a proper supply store and a post office. She'd gone for winter goods: flour, lamp oil, letters she was expecting from her sister back east. She hadn't come back. The mule had. I looked at the mule. I looked at the 2-hour ride of flat and scrub between us and Garver. The light was going. It was already cold the way early November in that country could get cold, fast, and without apology, and the sky was the color of a tin plate. "Get inside," I told her. "I'll go." She didn't argue, which told me she was scared, because Nora Crail argued about most things. I found the wagon about 4 miles out in a shallow arroyo where the trace dipped before the creek crossing. 2 men had run her off the road. Not random. They'd known the crossing, known the trace, known she'd be coming through alone. The wagon was tipped on its right wheel, one wheel cracked, and she was sitting in the bed of it in the cold dark with a rifle across her knees that she'd had sense enough to load before I got there. She hadn't fired it. She'd been waiting. One of the men was still there, the lesser one, sitting against a limestone rock about 20 feet off, holding his ear, which was bleeding. She'd hit him with the rifle stock when he'd grabbed her off the wagon seat. The other man, she said, had ridden off when she'd gotten hold of the rifle. She'd been sitting there 2 hours in the dropping cold, not knowing if he'd come back. I looked at the man by the rock. He was young, 20-something, stringy, the kind of man who needed 2 of himself to do what he'd tried to do and had found out the hard way he'd miscounted. I didn't shoot him. I wanted to. Instead, I told him something. I told him her name, and I told him whose land that arroyo was on, and I told him who I was. And I told him that if I saw him anywhere in that stretch of country again, the next conversation would be different. He heard me. I could tell by the way he looked at me, not with defiance but with the particular expression men get when they're measuring whether you mean what you said and deciding, correctly, that you do. He left. I got the wagon righted with a length of rope and the mules pulling, which took a while and was ugly and made my back feel its age. The wheel held. I drove her home. She didn't speak on the drive. Neither did I. The cold was hard by then, a clear, moonless cold, and we could see the lamp burning in the window of the house from almost 2 miles out, which I'd had the sense to leave lit. That winter was long. I don't mean long in the way people say when they mean tedious. I mean it was genuinely, physically long. The snows came early and stayed, and the creek froze solid in January, and there were 2 weeks in February when the temperature didn't get above 10 degrees in the afternoon, and we burned through the woodpile faster than I'd planned, and had to cut more from the dead-fall cottonwoods in the creek bottom, which is miserable work in frozen mud. I did it. That was what the winter was, doing what needed doing in sequence without complaint, because there was nobody else to do it. The 2 men came back in December. Not the young one, I never saw him again. The other one, the one who'd ridden off, came back with 3 others. They rode into the yard at mid-morning, easy and unhurried, which was a kind of threat in itself. 4 men, nice and slow, into a widow woman's yard. I was on the porch. They stopped about 30 feet out, and the one in front, the leader, started talking. He had the manner of a man who'd done this before, reasonable tone, friendly almost, explaining how the late Thomas Crail had owed a debt to a man in Garver named Petties, and how that debt transferred to the property, and how Petties was prepared to be fair about it, and so forth. It was a good speech. Practiced. I let him finish. Then I told him Thomas Crail's debts, if any, died with Thomas Crail under Texas law, and that Mrs. Crail held the deed, and that the 4 of them were on her property without invitation, and that they had about 1 more minute to start back the way they came before the pleasantness of this conversation ended. He looked at me the way the young one had looked at me in the arroyo, the same measuring. He was older than the young one, harder, and it took him longer to finish the math. They left. Nora had been inside with the rifle. She came out after. She didn't say anything. She put her hand briefly on my arm, just a moment, just the flat of her palm on my coat sleeve, then went back in to start dinner. That was the whole of it. That was enough. The rest of the winter was quieter. I don't want to make it sound like a romance that built in the ordinary way, with conversations by the fire and glances and so on, because it wasn't quite that. It was more like 2 people in close quarters in a hard season, doing the work, and gradually the work becoming something you did together rather than separately. She started saving me the good chair by the stove without being asked. I started doing the small repairs without waiting to be told. One night in January, the lamp went out for want of oil, and we sat in the dark for a while talking about nothing in particular, her sister's letters, what the spring might look like, whether the south pasture could run cattle again, and I understood that I wasn't in any hurry to go look for more oil. By March, the worst of it had broken. She came out one morning while I was working on the saddle. It needed stitching on the off-side skirt, a thing I'd been putting off, and she stood behind me for a minute without saying anything, which was unusual. Nora generally had something to say. Then she said, "You didn't have to stay." I kept working the awl through the leather. "No," I said. "I want you to know I know that." I looked at her then. She was standing in the yard in the morning light, which was thin and sharp the way March light is, and she had her arms crossed against the cold, but she was looking at me the direct way she had, steady and clear, the way a woman looks at you when she's decided something. "You stayed the whole winter," she said. "You faced down Petties' men twice. You cut wood in the frozen creek bottom until your hands bled. You never asked me for anything beyond what we'd agreed." She stopped. "I don't know many men like that. I don't know if I know any other men like that." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what to say. "I think," she said slowly, like she was being careful with something she didn't want to crack, "you might be the last good man alive." She said it plain, no ceremony, just the words. And the thing about Nora was she didn't say things she didn't mean. She hadn't married for flattery, hadn't survived that winter on sentiment, didn't deal in words as decoration. When she said a thing, she said it because it was the truest thing she had. I set the awl down. She came to me there in the yard, and she put both her hands flat on my chest, not grabbing, not clutching, just pressing, the way you put your hands on something to feel if it's solid, and she looked up at me with that steady, clear look. "Stay," she said. Not as a question, not as a plea, as an offer. She was giving me something, and she knew the weight of it, and she was giving it anyway. I covered her hands with mine. The spring came slow that year, the way it does in that country, the grass coming up yellow first and then finding its color. I fixed the south fence line proper. The mule fattened up. One morning I heard Nora in the kitchen before dawn, singing something low to herself, an old song I didn't know the name of. I lay there and listened to it and thought, this is the thing. This is the whole of the thing right here. I got up and went in for coffee, and she handed me the cup, and that was that.